5 teenagers walked onto a stage with one day of rehearsal between them. And within an hour, they had a record deal, a fan base, and a future none of them could have predicted. Within a week, that record deal was gone. Within 6 years, one of them would leave in tears on camera, saying goodbye to the only career he had ever known. This is the story of how 5 voices from a Texas high school built one of the most successful vocal groups in modern music, and what it actually cost them to get there. Not rumor, not speculation, just the parts of their story they were brave enough to tell in their own words. It started in the hallways of Martin High School in Arlington, Texas, long before any of it was real. Scott Hoying, Kirsten Maldonado, and Mitch Grassi were classmates who found each other through music, the way kids who feel a little out of step with everyone else sometimes do. None of them were the loudest people in the room. They were the kind of teenagers who found each other almost by instinct, drawn together, because singing made the ordinary parts of high school feel a little more bearable. They sang together for fun, entered a local radio contest with a cover of a Lady Gaga song, and lost. It didn't matter. Something had clicked between the 3 of them, a kind of vocal chemistry that doesn't show up on command and can't really be taught. When Scott left for the University of Southern California, he joined an elite collegiate a cappella group, immersing himself in arrangements and performance techniques that would later shape Pentatonix's whole approach to sound. But he never stopped thinking about the chemistry he'd had with Mitch and Kirsten back in Texas. College gave him new tools. It didn't give him a replacement for what the 3 of them had built together. Then came the opportunity that changed everything. NBC's The Sing-Off was casting its 3rd season, and the show required full 5-person groups. Scott called Mitch and Kirsten. They needed 2 more voices, and they needed them fast. Avi Kaplan, a bass vocalist, with a tone so deep and resonant it felt physical, joined the lineup. So did Kevin Olusala, a Yale graduate who had gone viral teaching himself to play cello and beatbox at the same time, a skill nobody had really seen before. The 5 of them met for the first time the day before their audition. One day of rehearsal. That was the entire runway they had before stepping in front of judges and a television audience. It worked anyway. Their arrangements were bold, their harmonies were tight, and they brought something to a cappella that the genre hadn't really had before. The production instincts of pop music, paired with 5 voices doing the work of a full band. Week after week on the show, they took apart familiar songs and rebuilt them as something unrecognizable and better, taking creative risks other competing groups wouldn't touch. They won Season 3 of The Sing-Off in 2011, walking away with $200,000 in prize money and a recording contract with Sony Music through Epic Records. It looked like the beginning of a fairy tale, the kind of overnight validation most young performers spend their whole lives chasing and never catch. Instead, it became their first real lesson in how unprepared the industry was for what they were doing. Within about a week of signing, Epic Records dropped them, before they'd even had the chance to release a single song under the deal. A cappella simply didn't fit the radio formula the label understood, and nobody at the company seemed to know what to do with 5 kids who had no instruments and no obvious genre. Scott has talked since then about how strange that period felt in real time, saying the group didn't fully register what had happened because their manager was already working on a new deal, and that the positivity of finally having real fans for the first time carried them past the sting of the rejection. It's a small detail, but it says a lot about the temperament that would carry them through everything still to come. Instead of treating the setback as proof they didn't belong, they treated it as proof they needed to build their own path. Most groups don't survive that kind of rejection so early. Pentatonix did, because they refused to wait for permission. They signed with Madison Gate, a small Sony-owned label mostly known for distributing movie soundtracks, and turned to YouTube to build an audience the traditional industry hadn't given them. They filmed their first videos on borrowed equipment, sometimes shot on nothing more sophisticated than an iPad, and uploaded covers that reimagined pop songs as 5-part vocal arrangements. Their take on Gaudier's Somebody That I Used to Know took off. Their evolution of music medley, tracing pop history through nothing but voices, went properly viral. Subscribers climbed into the millions. A fan base calling themselves Pentaholics formed almost overnight, and Pentatonix had effectively built a global career from a platform the music industry hadn't yet learned to take seriously. Their two early EPs, released independently through Madison Gate, climbed onto the Billboard charts with almost no traditional marketing behind them at all, proof that the audience they'd built themselves was real and paying attention. It paid off in a way that even Sony hadn't anticipated. A 2014 Grammy win for their arrangement of Daft Punk's music off their second EP caught the attention of the very label that had let them go. RCA Records signed Pentatonix, and their self-titled debut album reached #1. From there, it was a kind of momentum most bands never get close to. World tours, holiday specials that became an annual tradition for millions of households, and an eventual total of 3 Grammy wins. Kirsten Maldonado would later reflect that the industry's initial confusion about how to market an a cappella group wasn't really personal. It simply wasn't built to know what to do with a sound like theirs. But success at that speed comes with its own kind of weight, and the cost of that weight didn't show up in the music. It showed up in the lives behind it. Touring schedules for a group at that level are relentless by design. Albums, tours, viral content, award show appearances, and promotional obligations stack on top of each other with very little room to breathe. And Pentatonix lived inside that machine for years, often crisscrossing time zones with barely a day to recover before the next city and the next performance. For most of the group, the trade-off was difficult but survivable. The price of doing what they loved at a scale they'd never imagined. For one member, it became something closer to unsustainable. Avi Kaplan never set out to be famous. He was drawn to music as something spiritual and grounding, not as a vehicle for stardom. And the qualities that made his voice such an anchor for the group, its stillness, its depth, were the same qualities that made the noise and motion of touring life especially hard on him. For 6 years, he kept performing, kept showing up, kept giving the group everything his voice could offer, night after night, city after city. But the gap between who he was off stage and the life he was living on the road kept widening. And there's only so long a person can stretch across that kind of gap before something has to give. In May 2017, Avi sat down with his bandmates beside him and recorded a farewell video for fans. It wasn't a moment built on scandal or conflict. In his own words, posted alongside the video, he described the pace of life in Pentatonix as something he had struggled with throughout his entire time in the group, explaining that being away from family and friends when he or they needed each other had worn on him, and that he'd lost the ability to retreat into nature the way he needed to when life felt overwhelming. He made a point of saying he never wanted his decision to hold the rest of the group back in any way, that he believed in what they did and what they would go on to do without him. It was by every account an amicable split, but that didn't make it any less heartbreaking for the people watching it happen in real time. Fans who had grown attached to his low, grounding bass lines flooded social media with grief and confusion in equal measure, struggling to imagine the group's sound without him in it. Avi performed his final show with Pentatonix that September in Vermont, and the group that had built its entire identity around 5 irreplaceable voices suddenly had to figure out how to become 4, and then somehow 5 again. That's where Matt Saleh came in, a bass vocalist with a warm tone and a humility that fit the group's culture. Matt stepped into a role that came with an almost impossible amount of emotional baggage attached to it. He wasn't just learning new arrangements. He was walking into a fan base still actively grieving the person he was replacing, joining a group whose sound was so tightly woven that every new voice would be measured, fairly or not, against the one that came before. There was no version of that transition that wasn't going to be hard. Matt handled it by doing the only thing that actually works in a situation like that. He didn't try to become Avi. He spent his early years with the group earning trust on his own terms, song by song and tour by tour, and over time, what started as an impossible position became, by all appearances, a genuine and permanent place within the family Pentatonix had built. The years that followed reshaped every remaining member in ways that played out publicly, even if the full emotional weight of those changes stayed private. Scott Hoying, who had carried much of the group's public-facing leadership since their earliest days, eventually built a life outside the group that gave him a different kind of grounding. He met Mark Manio in 2017. The two became inseparable, and after 5 years together, Scott proposed in 2022. They married in July 2023 in Santa Barbara, California, and in 2025 announced they were expecting their first child together. Scott has continued to push his creative range further too, including a stint as a competitor on Dancing with the Stars, while still anchoring Pentatonix's sound and direction. Mitch Grassi, long known as one of the group's most expressive and unpredictable voices, eventually built an entirely separate musical identity under the name Messer. It's a project that sounds nothing like Pentatonix on purpose, darker, more electronic, more nakedly personal. In interviews, Mitch has spoken candidly about growing up in conservative Texas and feeling, in his words, a kind of slow burn damage to his sense of identity from rigid expectations around how he was supposed to look and act. He's described never having been the clean-cut, normal member of the group, even within Pentatonix itself, and has talked about using his solo work to process parts of himself, sometimes calling it shadow work, that didn't have anywhere to go inside the polished world of a Grammy-winning vocal group. It's not a story of public collapse. It's a story of an artist quietly building a second outlet for the parts of himself the main act never had room for. Kirsten Maldonado, the only woman in the lineup since the beginning, also carved out a solo identity in the years since, releasing music independently and stepping more fully into her own artistic voice outside the group's harmonies. And Kevin Olusala, the group's steady center, used the slower pace of the pandemic years to reflect on an identity question that had followed him since childhood. In 2025, he released his debut solo album, Dawn of a Misfit, and spoke openly in interviews about what shaped it. Growing up as a kid with Nigerian and Grenadian heritage in Kentucky, he said he never quite felt like he belonged anywhere, describing being teased and feeling like he wasn't accepted as fully black by black classmates or fully welcomed by white ones either. He's talked about asking, even well into adulthood, why he didn't seem to fit anywhere. Becoming a father changed how he carries that question now. He's described the album as something close to a history book for his children, a way for them to understand him and feel celebrated for every part of who they are. As for Avi, leaving Pentatonix was never the end of his career, just a turn in a different direction. He's continued releasing music as an independent artist, leaning into the folk and Americana sound that had always felt more like home to him than arena stages did. By his own account, stepping away from Pentatonix wasn't a tragedy so much as a course correction, a choice to protect the parts of his life that mattered most to him even when it meant walking away from enormous success to do it. What's striking, looking at the full arc of this story, is that there's no villain in it. No betrayal, no feud, no scandal hiding behind the headlines. Just 5, then 6 ordinary people who were handed an extraordinary amount of attention very quickly, and who each had to figure out, often in full public view, what that attention was going to cost them and what they were and weren't willing to pay. Avi paid with his place in the group he helped build, choosing his family and his peace over a stage that no longer fit who he was. The others paid in quieter ways, through years of relentless schedules, through the strange particular pressure of being expected to sound perfect together while building separate, complicated lives apart, and through the slower, harder work of figuring out who they were as individuals once the spotlight had been on them for the better part of a decade. And yet the group is still here. Pentatonix continues to sell out tours. Their holiday albums remain a seasonal tradition for millions of households. And their YouTube channel has racked up billions of views, introducing new generations of listeners to a cappella music done at a level almost no one else has matched. 3 Grammy wins, more than a decade of output, and a lineup that has proven, through one of the hardest transitions a group can go through, that it could lose a founding member and still keep its identity intact. That's not a small thing. Plenty of groups don't survive losing a piece of their original sound. Pentatonix did, partly because Matt Salih turned an impossible job into a genuine home, and partly because the 5, now 6, people who have worn that name over the years never stopped choosing to make music honestly, even when honesty meant admitting the cost was real. What makes their story worth telling isn't that it's uniquely tragic. Plenty of people experience burnout, identity struggles, and the ache of choosing between a dream and the people they love. What makes it worth telling is how openly this particular group has been willing to talk about it, on camera, in interviews, in farewell videos and solo albums built around the very things that were hardest to say out loud. Avi told fans exactly why he was leaving instead of letting the silence fill in with rumor. Kevin built an entire record around the question of where he belonged. Mitch has talked publicly about the parts of himself Pentatonix's polish never quite had room for. None of them needed to share any of that. They did anyway. And that honesty is arguably as much a part of their legacy now as the harmonies that made them famous in the first place. That's really the through line of this whole story. Not tragedy in the dramatic, scandal-driven sense the word usually implies, but something closer to the truth of what it actually takes to sustain a creative life at that scale. Sacrifice, reinvention, the occasional painful goodbye, and the quiet decision, made again and again by every member of this group, to keep singing anyway. If their journey moved you, let us know in the comments which part of their story stuck with you the most, and subscribe for more deep dives into the real stories behind the music you grew up with.